All right, so the last of our lipids that we're going to talk about are the steroids, which are not fatty acid based, right? So we spent a ton of time talking about fatty acids and then all the different lipids that are fatty acid based. Now we're going to talk about steroids, which is the only lipid that isn't fatty acid based. Um, the most famous one being cholesterol, and we'll talk about why this is such an it's both essential and problematic. You can see from these two cross sections of an artery that what happens when you have too much cholesterol in your diet is it will literally build up and form a plaque that ends up clogging your arteries, right? So on the left, you have this beautifully clear artery, and on the right, you have an artery that's clogged by a plaque made up of different cholesterols. Remember that we talked about how all of our steroid lipids have this same fundamental, like internal structure. They have the same core structure, which is what's called the steroid nucleus. Okay. And that is 3 cyclohexane rings and 1 cyclopentane ring. Always the same cluster of 3 6-membered rings, 1 5-membered ring, all bound together. All right. You can designate these rings A, B, C, D. I'm not going to make you learn how to number the rings, although it's not a bad idea to know the fact that you have this cheat sheet here. Suffice it to say that basically the difference between all the different steroids in our body, and hormones are a really important class of steroid, is that they're sort of the same internal structure, the same steroid nucleus is decorated a little bit differently. So sometimes there's a few methyl groups coming off. Sometimes there's a big long chain coming off. Sometimes there's alcohol groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have the same core structure, the same steroid nucleus, and then they're just kind of decorated differently. The most important one is cholesterol. Okay, so first of all, cholesterol. So actually, let's just convince ourselves that this is indeed got that same steroid nucleus. Here's the first 6-membered ring, second 6-membered ring, third 6-membered ring, and then our 5-membered ring, right? And then you can see that it's decorated a little bit differently. So here's a methyl group here, a methyl group here, hydroxyl group. Here's a double bond, and then you have this big hydrocarbon tail, right? So these are going to be the features that differentiate our different steroids. I'm not going to expect you to memorize the structure for cholesterol. All right, just FYI. I do want you to know that it's the most important steroid that we have in our body. And the reason is because it's the building block for all the other steroids. So cholesterol is the steroid that we get through our diet, and then our body transforms it into the other steroids that it needs. So for example, guys will have their cholesterol being transformed into testosterone in a sort of large quantity, whereas females will have their cholesterol being transformed into estrogen in large quantities. And those two different steroid molecules are going to signal very different development patterns for males and females, right? So the cholesterol is the base. It's the building block for all the other steroids that your body's going to need. We get it from in our diet, from especially if you're a meat eater. It's present in meat and dairy in a lot of ways. Your body can actually make it all on its own, which is why if you have a plant-based diet, you're not at any sort of a shortage of cholesterol. It is used. All right, in addition to being the basic building block for all the other steroids, it does have a component in cell membranes as well as nerve tissues. Vitamin D can be synthesized from cholesterol. So it does have other sort of roles other than just being the building block for the steroid hormones, but that's a very big important role. When do you have too much cholesterol? If you're exceeding a sort of blood or a plasma cholesterol level of 200 milligrams per deciliter. Yeah, fuck that. Okay, so given a lipid that is a steroid, let's at least make sure that we can go in and classify the different functional groups on it. This is almost a throwback to organic chemistry. This is actually cholesterol here, and let's see if we can characterize what these different groups are, right? Most importantly, to be able to spot is the fact that that steroid nucleus is that chunk here, that six-membered ring fused to a six-membered ring, fused to a six-membered ring, fused to a five-membered ring. It also has this hydroxyl group, which would be component A, as well as this methyl group, which would be component B. And then that long hydrocarbon tail, it's not that long compared to some of the fatty acids we've seen, but that would be the D selection. Another important lipid that would be derived from cholesterol is a bile salt, all right? A bile salt is something that's made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder. Importantly, though, it has a polar region and a non-polar region. And it's almost acting like a soap within the body, right? So we talked about how soaps, they have a non-polar region and a polar region. And when you're washing your hands, the non-polar region buries into all the dirt and gook, and then the polar region is what allows it to be carried by the water down the drain. Well, you can imagine that the human body has the same problem in that we're mostly water, right? So if we eat a bunch of gunk that's non-polar, how do we get it out? That's the role of a bile salt. So a bile salt will have a non-polar region and a polar region. The non-polar region will stick all that non-polar gunk we want gone, and then the polar region will allow it to be carried out through our various waste mechanisms. This is an example of a bile salt. So this is the polar region right here, which is derived from glycine, which is an amino acid. The non-polar region, look at this, is that steroid nucleus. Notice it's not a long fatty acid chain, right? So just by virtue of being many carbons clumped together like this, that's also a non-polar molecule, right? So you don't have to always be a long carbon chain in order to be non-polar. The steroid nucleus itself is non-polar and will bind those non-polar molecules. So for example, when your body's trying to get rid of fats, so you eat a really fatty meal and your body's trying to digest it, the long chain of those fatty acids, that was terrible, will be interacting with, oh my God, I can't do it. The long chain of those fatty acids, right? So let's say we have, I'm not going to draw a whole shtick here, but let's just say that this is a triacyl glycerol. These nonpolar components will stick to the nonpolar component in my steroid nucleus, and then because of this polar head, it will allow it to get flushed from your system. The other big ones, and I sort of hinted at this before, but hormones are considered to be steroids, right? So they have that same steroid nucleus. Of course, the big one being the various sex hormones that we have running through our bodies that have especially humongous impact on us during development, but even into our future and into adulthood, they have significant roles, right? So the male sex hormones, the biggest one, the most famous one would be testosterone, as well as androzone. For females, it's estrogen and progesterone. These are all derived from that same steroid nucleus, right? So your body can convert cholesterol, my body will convert cholesterol to testosterone, whereas females' body will convert cholesterol to estrogen. And again, those molecules are sort of signal molecules that tell your cells what to do and how to develop. There's another class we're going to talk about here called the corticosteroids from adrenal glands. So let's see those in a second here. Just focusing on the various sex hormones. You could take a look at these and just convince yourself pretty quickly that they indeed are derived from that same steroid nucleus, right? They have that same basic framework. And then what's different about them? Well, they're decorated with slightly different functional groups, right? So these are all sort of different functional groups that differentiate those. Whoops, same color. I mean, and somewhat amazingly, right? Let's just look at these real quick. On some fundamental difference, this is the difference between males and females, right? Like, yeah, I mean, these molecules right here signal very key things about how your DNA should be read, how your cells should express certain things. And so this is testosterone versus estrogen. You see functionally, they have that same steroid core. Look, they even have some of the same features. They differ by oxidation state of this oxygen. I guess we got a methyl group here. And then this is a full benzene ring as opposed to just one double bond. But kind of amazing that you know, a cell will know to behave differently based on which one of these two molecules binds to it. Hormones are incredibly powerful in their ability to change the chemistry of a particular cell. Okay, and then the other one, so sex hormones, I think we've all sort of been introduced to through pop culture and stuff like that. There's another class of hormones that are really important called these adrenal corticosteroids. And these are actually produced by these adrenal glands that sit atop your kidneys. They are important to regulating some sort of like, kind of like behind the scenes sort of stuff. So the concentration of electrolytes within your blood, as well as the amount of water in your system, right? So how often are you urinating, stuff like that, right? Would be controlled by these steroids. Yeah, so aldosterone is electrolytes in water, whereas cortisone is going to be regulating, use a different color. Sort of varies with your blood glucose levels, as well as how much glycogen, which we talked about in our carbohydrates lecture, right? So this is like the animal starch is being synthesized within the liver. You can increase these levels. So cortisone, you might have heard of for inflammation, in particular, like allergic reaction type of stuff. And a side effect of something like Benadryl, which affects these adrenal glands, is increased thirst and increased urination. Funny story we had when we got our new dog, he had an allergic reaction and he was probably like 6 months old or something like that. And so we gave him Benadryl to help tone down the swelling, which was like his face was all swollen. Who knew that a side effect of that was exactly this sort of idea of this water electrolyte balance, where he couldn't control his pee whatsoever. And so we went for having no accidents in the house to having like 5 within a day because he was on this particular medication, which affected his adrenal glands. And again, you can just see by looking at these various molecules that they all indeed have that same steroid nucleus, right? So they're all derived from that same source. Your body is making these, and largely it's cholesterol that it's pulling from when it's making these. Okay, so lastly, now that we've learned about all of our different lipids, let's see if we can classify the following as being a fatty acid, a steroid, or a triacylglycerol. There would have been one more category we could have included in here, which would have been, well, a few more. We could have had a sphingosine, a sphingomyelin or a sphingolipid, as well as our phospholipid class. Okay, anyways, let's try to differentiate between these 3 categories. Cholesterol would be a steroid. Stearic acid, that would be from our fatty acids constant page. So that's just a fatty acid. Glyceryl tristearate is now going to be a triacyl glycerol composed of 3 molecules of stearic acid. Estradiol is the name of estrogen, so that is also a steroid. And which lipid contains no fatty acids? Those would be the steroids, right? Instead, they contain that steroid nucleus. Cool.